The millionaire returns home early, expecting to find the silence that has consumed his mansion since his wife's death. But as he crosses the hall, he hears something impossible, the lively laughter of his triplet daughters echoing through the house. When he opens the living room door and sees the new nanny playing with them, as no one had managed to in 8 months, his emotional world both shatters and is reborn at the same time. And in that transformative instant, he realizes her arrival was no accident. It was the beginning of everything changing. Ethan Hayes gripped the steering wheel of his Mercedes so tightly that his knuckles turned white. The New York City traffic was crawling along Park Avenue on that Tuesday afternoon, and every second stuck between luxury cars and hurried executives seemed to amplify the pressure hammering at his temples. At 4 in the afternoon, he had simply stood up from the boardroom table, grabbed his Italian leather briefcase, and left without an explanation to anyone. The directors were left speechless, the investors perplexed, but Ethan didn't care. Not anymore. The meeting had been a complete disaster. The launch of the new logistics app, in which he had invested millions, had failed spectacularly. Only 3,000 downloads in the first week when projections were for 50,000. The investors questioned every decision, every cent spent, every promise Ethan had made over the last 6 months. He, who had built an empire from scratch, who had turned a small tech startup into a corporation valued at hundreds of millions, was being treated like an incompetent amateur. But it wasn't the professional failure that was destroying him inside. It was the constant suffocating feeling that everything in his life was falling apart and he had absolutely no control over any of it. Business success had always been his refuge, his safe territory, the place where he knew exactly what to do. Now, not even that remained. Ethan turned right, heading toward Greenwich, Connecticut, ascending the tree-lined hill that led to the gated community where his mansion was located. The trees formed a green tunnel over the street, partially blocking the afternoon sun. He showed his access card to the guard at the gatehouse, who nodded respectfully. The wrought-iron gate opened with a smooth, well-oiled sound. Money could buy that kind of quiet efficiency, but it couldn't buy what truly mattered. The mansion appeared at the end of the private drive. 3 stories of modern architecture, glass and exposed concrete, with impeccable gardens designed by an award-winning landscape artist. Eleanor had chosen every detail of that house. She had spent 2 years working with architects and decorators, creating what she called our private paradise. Ethan parked in the spacious garage that housed 4 other vehicles. He turned off the engine and sat there in the silence for a moment too long. 8 months. 8 months had passed since that April morning when everything ended. Eleanor had woken up early because the triplets had colds, coughs, low-grade fevers, nothing serious. She said she was going to the pharmacy to get cough syrup and children's fever reducer. Ethan was still asleep when she left. He never saw her alive again. The phone call came 2 hours later. Acute cardiac complications, they said. A congenital condition no one knew existed. She had collapsed in the pharmacy, surrounded by strangers, far from home, far from him, far from the girls who were waiting for their cold medicine. Ethan squeezed his eyes shut, trying to push the memories away. It didn't work. It never worked. He got out of the car, grabbed the briefcase that no longer mattered, and walked to the side entrance of the house. He loosened his silk tie as he punched in the code for the door. The air conditioning greeted him with an artificial coolness. Everything in that house was perfect, functional, expensive, and utterly lifeless. The silence was usually the first thing that hit him when he got home, a heavy, oppressive silence that seemed to have a texture that clung to his skin like a viscous film. But on that afternoon, something was different. Ethan stopped in the entrance hall frowning. There was a sound coming from inside the house, not the discreet hum of staff working or the murmur of the television. It was something else. It was laughter. Ethan felt his heart pound in his chest. Childlike laughter, high-pitched and crystal clear, echoing through the house like music he thought he would never hear again. His daughters, his triplets, Grace, Emily, and Olivia were laughing, truly laughing, with that carefree, pure joy he hadn't heard since before Eleanor was gone. The leather briefcase slipped from his hand and fell to the marble floor with a dull thud. Ethan didn't care. He walked down the wide hallway like a man in a trance, following the impossible sound of that laughter. His hands were trembling. His heart was beating so hard he could hear the pulse in his ears. The laughter was coming from the living room, that enormous space with a double-height ceiling that Eleanor had loved so much. The door was ajar. Ethan pushed it open slowly, almost afraid the sound would disappear if he made any sudden movements. What he saw on the other side made him freeze completely. In the middle of the living room, on the $30,000 Persian rug that Eleanor had chosen at a charity auction, was the nanny, Julia, the young woman his mother-in-law, Margaret, had hired a month ago. Ethan barely remembered the conversation. He had been in a crucial meeting about mergers and acquisitions when Margaret called asking for his approval. He had said yes without even asking for details and hung up. That had been 4 weeks ago. Julia was on all fours on the floor, pretending to be a horse. Her curved back formed a makeshift saddle where the 3 triplets were sitting, one behind the other, holding on to each other. Grace, first in line, held an imaginary rope as if they were reins. Julia shook her head from side to side, neighed in an exaggerated, comical way, and galloped in slow motion across the room. And the girls were laughing so hard their identical little faces were red, their eyes shining with a joy Ethan thought had been buried forever. Emily, the one in the middle, shouted, "Faster, horsey, faster!" Olivia, the youngest by 3 minutes, let out high-pitched squeals every time Julia pretended to stumble, and recovered at the last second. Grace was laughing so hard she could barely hold on, and Julia, that 27-year-old woman he barely knew, was laughing along with them as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Ethan couldn't move. He couldn't breathe properly. He couldn't process what he was seeing. His daughters, those 3 identical little girls who had become silent little statues wandering through the mansion, who woke up crying every night, who asked when Mommy was coming back in voices so soft he could barely hear them. They were playing, truly playing, with total abandon, momentarily forgetting the pain they carried, and it wasn't with him. It wasn't with their millionaire father who had bought every expensive toy imaginable, who had hired the best child psychologist in New York City, who had reorganized the entire household routine according to manuals from experts in childhood grief. It was with this woman he had barely paid attention to when hiring her, a young woman with no impressive university degrees, no credentials from renowned institutions, who came from a simple neighborhood in Queens and was now on the floor of his living room making his daughters laugh like they hadn't in 8 months. Julia looked up at that moment. Her eyes met Ethan's as he stood in the doorway. The smile instantly vanished from her face. She froze in her makeshift horse position, clearly startled. The 3 girls noticed the change and turned their little heads toward the door. Upon seeing their father, they quickly slid off Julia's back and clustered around her, as if protecting something precious. Ethan wanted to say something, anything, but his throat was completely tight. Tears burned in his eyes, threatening to spill over. He pressed his lips together firmly, trying to maintain the control that was hanging by a thread. Julia slowly stood up, smoothing her simple clothes with her hands, clearly expecting a reprimand. The girls clung to her skirt. The silence in the room was now deafening. Julia opened her mouth as if to say something, perhaps to apologize for playing instead of caring for the girls in a more formal manner. But no sound came out. Ethan just stood there, looking at this scene that was destroying and rebuilding him at the same time. This woman had done the impossible. She had given joy back to his daughters. She had brought life back into this house that was a mausoleum. Finally, Ethan made the only gesture he could manage. He nodded once, a small, almost imperceptible movement, but one that carried the full weight of an overwhelming gratitude he didn't know how to express. Then he turned quickly and left the room before the tears began to fall. He walked down the corridor with quick steps, went up the stairs to the 2nd floor, and locked himself in his private study. He leaned against the solid wood door and finally allowed the tears to fall. He cried as he hadn't cried since the funeral. He cried for the wife he had lost, for the daughters who had been lost in their grief, for himself who was completely lost. But he also cried with relief, because for the first time in 8 endless months, there was hope. Ethan slid down the door until he was sitting on the study floor hugging his knees. Downstairs he could hear the laughter starting up again. Julia had gone back to playing with the girls. The sound floated up the stairs like a promise that maybe, just maybe, his family could find its way back to life. He sat there in the dark for how long he couldn't say. When he finally stood up and walked to the window, the sun was beginning to set over New York City. The city lights were starting to flicker on, one by one, millions of luminous points spreading to the horizon. His life had become complete darkness, but now there was a small light. A light brought by a simple young woman his mother-in-law had hired almost by chance. Ethan took out his phone and opened the file Margaret had sent about Julia. He had never really read it. He quickly scanned the information. Julia. Clark, 27 years old, high school graduate, a few references from families she had worked for before, and at the end, a handwritten note, photographed and attached to the file. The handwriting was simple but firm. I understand grief. I won't run from it. Those 6 words hit him like a punch to the gut. All the other nannies had run, 3 women in 7 months, all with impeccable resumes, all unable to handle the emotional weight of that house. But Julia hadn't run. She had stayed. And somehow, mysteriously, she was healing what he thought was incurable. Ethan couldn't sleep that night. He sat in his private study with the lights off, looking out the panoramic window at the lights of New York City twinkling in the distance. The image of the triplets riding on Julia's back, laughing with that pure, forgotten joy, wouldn't leave his mind. That sound kept echoing in his ears like a melody he thought he had lost forever. At 3 in the morning, he gave up trying to sleep. He went down to the kitchen in silence, made coffee that was too strong, and sat at the marble island alone with his thoughts. The house was completely silent. There were no more nightly screams coming from the girls' rooms. This was new. For the past few months, at least one of them would wake up crying every night, sometimes all 3 together. Ethan would run upstairs, try to calm them, but he never knew what to say or do. They would just curl up in bed asking for their mother in broken voices that shattered his heart. But that night, silence. A different kind of silence. Not the heavy, suffocating silence of a house in mourning, but the peaceful silence of children sleeping soundly. Could it be possible that Julia was already making a difference even in this? Had one single afternoon of play been enough for his daughters to sleep through the night? It seemed impossible, improbable, but it was real. When the sun rose over the city, Ethan was already dressed in an impeccable grey suit. He left for the office at his usual time, but something was different. For the first time in 8 months, he wasn't just fleeing the empty house. He was leaving because he had to, but with the strange feeling that there would be something waiting for him when he returned. Not just silence and shadows, but life. The day at the office passed in slow motion. Ethan attended 3 meetings, signed dozens of documents, answered urgent emails, but his mind was elsewhere. It was on the triplets. He was wondering what Julia was doing with them at that moment. Were they playing again? Were they laughing? For the first time in months, he wanted to be home. At 5 in the afternoon, Ethan made up an excuse about an important call he needed to take at home and left the office. His assistant gave him a surprised look. He never left before 8. But Ethan just grabbed his briefcase and left, ignoring the curious stares. The traffic was heavy as always, but Ethan didn't mind. He drummed his fingers on the steering wheel, impatient, wanting to get there. When he finally entered the gated community and drove up the driveway to the mansion, his heart was racing in a way that had nothing to do with stress or anxiety. It was anticipation, it was hope. He entered through the main door instead of the side one. The house was illuminated by the golden late afternoon light streaming through the enormous windows. And there was sound, voices coming from the backyard. Ethan dropped his briefcase in the hall and walked toward the glass doors that led to the outdoor area. What he saw made him stop on the threshold. Julia was sitting on the grass with the 3 girls around her. They had books scattered on the ground. Julia was holding one open and reading aloud, using different voices for each character. The triplets were completely engrossed, their little eyes fixed on the book, their identical faces showing expressions of fascination. Every so often, one of them would interrupt to ask a question, and Julia would stop, explain patiently, and answer with genuine attention. Ethan stood there watching for several minutes. Julia wore simple clothes, jeans and a white cotton shirt. She was barefoot on the grass, her brown hair tied back in an uncomplicated ponytail. There was nothing extraordinary about her appearance. She was an ordinary, hard-working young woman without the sophisticated airs of the other nannies who had passed through the house. But there was something about her that was magnetic, a tranquility, a genuine presence that made even him, from a distance, feel a little more at peace. Emily was the first to notice her father standing in the doorway. She nudged Grace, who nudged Olivia. The three of them looked at Ethan at the same time, their identical little eyes wide. Julia turned as well, clearly surprised to see him home so early. Ethan took a hesitant step toward them. "What's that story about?" he asked, trying to sound casual but feeling awkward. Grace held up the book to show him. "It's about a girl who talks to animals," she answered, her little voice still shy but less frightened than it used to be. His heart tightened. She was talking to him, really talking, not just responding with monosyllables or running to her room. "Cool," he said, not knowing what else to say. "Can I sit?" The three girls looked at Julia as if asking for permission. Julia nodded with an encouraging smile. "Of course," she said. Ethan took off his suit jacket, loosened his tie, and sat on the grass a few feet from the group. The grass was soft, well tended by the gardeners who came twice a week. Eleanor had loved that garden. She had designed the landscaping herself, chosen every plant, every flower. Julia resumed reading. Her voice was soft but expressive. The girls went back to concentrating on the story. Ethan just sat there watching the way Olivia leaned against Julia's arm, how Emily played with the hem of the nanny's shirt as she listened, how Grace pointed at the illustrations and Julia tilted the book so she could see better. Small, simple gestures, but full of natural, uncomplicated affection. When the story ended, the sun was already setting. Julia closed the book and announced it was time for their bath. The girls complained a little, but without drama. They got up and ran inside the house in a line, their light footsteps echoing down the hall. Julia began to gather the books scattered on the grass. "Let me help," Ethan said, kneeling to pick up a few volumes. Julia looked at him, surprised, but didn't protest. They worked in silence for a few moments, gathering the books and organizing them into a wicker basket. When they finished, they stood there, he with his hands in his pockets, she holding the basket. "They slept through the night yesterday," Ethan said suddenly. Julia blinked, processing the information. "They did?" she asked. "Yes," he confirmed. "For the first time in 8 months. No nightmares, no screaming, silence." Julia smiled, a small but genuine smile. "I'm glad," she said simply. Ethan wanted to ask how. How had she done it? What was her secret? What did she have that he didn't? But the words wouldn't come. Instead, he asked, "Have you worked with children who've been through difficult situations before?" Julia looked away for a moment, as if deciding how much to share. "I have," she finally answered. "But every child is different. Every pain is unique. What worked before might not work now." "But it is working," Ethan said, his voice thick with an emotion he tried to hide. "With them. It's working with my daughters." Julia looked him directly in the eye for the first time since he'd arrived. "They're incredible girls," she said. "They just needed to feel safe enough to be children again." "Safe," Ethan repeated the word as if tasting it. "I tried to give them security. I tried everything." Julia shook her head gently. "It's not about what you do," she said. "It's about how you are when you do it. Children feel it. They know when someone is afraid or when someone is at peace. I'm not afraid of their pain, so they don't have to be afraid to feel it around me." The words hit Ethan like a punch. He was afraid. Afraid of his daughter's pain because it amplified his own. Afraid of not knowing what to do, of saying the wrong thing, of making everything worse. Julia was right. He was so lost in his own grief that he had become incapable of helping the girls with theirs. "I need to go give them their bath," Julia said gently, breaking the silence that had formed. Ethan just nodded. Julia walked toward the house but stopped before going inside. She looked over her shoulder and said, "You're welcome to join in. The games, the stories, everything. They need their father too." And then she went inside, leaving Ethan alone in the garden as night fell over New York City. Ethan stood there for a long time. The automatic garden lights came on, illuminating the carefully arranged plants. Through the open window on the second floor, he could hear the sound of running water and the girls' giggles during their bath. Normal sounds. The sounds of a living house. Sounds he thought he would never hear again. That night, Ethan had dinner with the girls for the first time in weeks. Julia had prepared a simple meal: rice, beans, grilled chicken, and salad. Nothing elaborate like the dishes the cook made. The girls ate with appetite, chatting amongst themselves about their day. Ethan was quieter, just observing, but his presence there was already a step. When the girls went to bed, Ethan walked them to the room they shared. 3 identical beds with pink sheets that Eleanor had chosen. Julia helped each one settle. Tucked in the blankets and gave each a good-night kiss on the forehead. Ethan stood in the doorway, unsure if he should come in or not. Grace, always the bravest, held out her little arms to him. "Good night, Daddy," she said. The world stopped for a second. Daddy. She hadn't called him that in so long. Ethan felt his eyes burn, but managed to control himself. He walked to her bed and leaned down to kiss her forehead. "Good night, Grace," he whispered. He did the same with Emily and Olivia, who watched him with sleepy but no longer frightened eyes. When he left the room, Julia was waiting in the hallway. "They'll sleep well," she said with certainty. Ethan nodded, not trusting his voice at that moment. Julia started down the stairs, probably heading to the staff room on the ground floor. Ethan stood there in the dark hallway, listening to the soft breathing of his daughters through the ajar door. The following days brought a subtle but profound change to the mansion's routine. Ethan started leaving the office earlier, making up different excuses each day. Meeting cancelled, client postponed, need to review documents at home. His assistant, no longer questioned him, just adjusted his schedule without comment. The truth that Ethan barely admitted to himself was simple and yet far too complex. He wanted to be there. He wanted to see his daughters. He wanted to watch the magic that Julia made happen every day. He wanted to understand how this young woman, with no impressive academic background, could achieve what teams of expensive professionals had failed to do. On a rainy Thursday, Ethan arrived home at 4:30 in the afternoon. The rain drummed on the roof and windows, creating an aquatic symphony that Eleanor had always said was relaxing. He found Julia and the triplets in the living room, but they weren't playing. They were sitting on the large sofa, the 3 girls snuggled up against Julia, who was holding a photo album on her lap. Ethan froze at the entrance to the room. That album. It was his and Eleanor's wedding album. He had put it away in a drawer months ago because he couldn't bear to look at those images of lost happiness. How had Julia found it? Why was she showing it to the girls? Julia looked up and saw him standing there. There was no guilt on her face, only tranquility. "We were talking about Mommy," she explained simply. "The girls wanted to see pictures of her." Ethan felt the urge to ask them to put the album away, to stop what felt like unnecessary torture, but something made him stop. The triplets' expressions were not of suffering, they were of serene concentration, of quiet curiosity. "You can come see with us, Daddy," Emily said, her little voice still soft, but without fear. Ethan hesitated. Every fiber of his being wanted to run to avoid that pain. But the invitation in his daughter's eyes was impossible to refuse. He walked slowly to the sofa and sat on the other side with Olivia between him and Julia. Julia turned a page. There was Eleanor on their wedding day, radiant in her white dress, smiling at the camera with that genuine joy that defined her. "She's so pretty," Grace whispered. "Yes," Ethan agreed, his voice hoarse. "She was the most beautiful woman who ever lived." Olivia pointed to the photo. "Mommy is happy here." "Yes," Ethan said. She was very happy that day. Julia continued to turn the pages slowly, unhurriedly. Photos of the reception, The first danced the guests. The girls asked questions and Ethan answered, each word costing him an effort but also bringing a strange relief. It was painful, but it was also good. To talk about Eleanor, to remember her not just as the absence she had left, but as the presence she had been. Emily pointed to a photo where Eleanor was laughing uncontrollably. "Why is Mommy laughing so hard?" Ethan looked at the image, and to his surprise, a smile touched his lips. "Your Uncle Michael told a terrible joke during his speech," he explained. "It was so bad. It was funny. Your mom was like that. She laughed at everything, even things that weren't funny, and when she started laughing, it was impossible not to laugh with her." The triplets smiled, absorbing that piece of their mother they didn't fully remember. Julia closed the album carefully. "Your mommy seems like she was an amazing person," she said, looking at the girls. "You're lucky to be her daughters." Grace hugged the album to her chest. "I wish she would come back." "We all do," Ethan said, his voice breaking a little. "But she can't come back, my love, and it's okay to miss her. It's okay to be sad sometimes." The words came out before he could censor them, but they sounded right. True. Olivia looked at her father with her big eyes and asked, "Are you sad too, Daddy?" "I am," Ethan admitted. "I'm sad every day." Emily furrowed her brow. "But Julia said we can be sad and happy at the same time. Is that true?" Ethan looked at Julia, who met his gaze with serenity. "Yes," he said slowly. "I think that's true. We can miss Mommy and still play and laugh and be happy. She would have wanted you to be happy." Grace rested her head on Ethan's shoulder. "Do you think Mommy can see us from where she is?" Ethan swallowed hard. "I don't know, my love, but I think if she can, she's watching, and she's proud of how strong and brave you three are." The girls fell silent, processing those words. The rain continued to fall outside, a constant comforting sound. Julia stood up carefully. "How about we make some hot chocolate?" she suggested. "It's the perfect day for it." The three girls nodded enthusiastically and ran off to the kitchen. Ethan remained on the sofa, holding the wedding album in his lap. Julia lingered for a moment. "I'm sorry if I overstepped," she said quietly. "They asked about their mother, and I thought it was important not to avoid the subject." Ethan shook his head. "You did the right thing," he said. "I'm the one who's been avoiding it. I thought not talking about her would lessen their pain, but it just made everything worse, didn't it?" "The pain is still there. It just gets trapped inside," Julia replied. "Letting it out a little at a time is what helps it heal." Ethan looked at her, really looked. Julia didn't look away, didn't shrink under his scrutiny. There was a strength in her, a quiet, unshakable strength. "How did you learn all this?" he asked. Julia hesitated, then sat down next to him on the sofa again. "I lost my younger sister when I was 18, she said calmly. "She was 12. It was a car accident on the way to school. My family fell apart. My parents sank into silence, pretending nothing had happened. We didn't talk about her, it was like she never existed, and it destroyed us from the inside out." Ethan listened in silence, feeling the weight of that revelation. "I'm so sorry," he said. Julia shrugged slightly. "It's been 11 years now. I learned the hard way that ignoring pain doesn't make it go away. It just turns it into something darker and heavier. So when I saw the ad to work here, when your mother-in-law told me about the situation, I knew I could help. Because I understand. I truly understand." They sat in silence for a moment, the wedding album still open between them. Ethan felt a strange connection to this young woman who was supposed to be just another employee, but Julia was more than that. She was someone who understood the language of loss, who could navigate the territory of grief without fear. "Thank you," Ethan said finally, "for being here, for doing what I couldn't." "You're doing it now," Julia replied softly. "You're here, you're trying. That's what matters." Grace's shout calling them from the kitchen broke the moment. Julia stood up with a smile. "Better go before they try to make the chocolate themselves and destroy the kitchen." Ethan laughed, a hoarse but genuine sound. He followed her to the kitchen, where he found the triplets already trying to reach the cocoa powder on the high shelf. Julia prepared the hot chocolate with enthusiastic help from the girls, who were more of a hindrance than a help. Ethan watched, leaning against the counter, seeing his daughters fight over who would stir the pot, who would pour the milk, who would add the sugar. These were normal scenes from a normal family, scenes that had vanished from the house along with Eleanor, but they were coming back slowly, brought by the presence of this young woman who was not afraid to love broken children. They drank hot chocolate together at the kitchen table, the girls with brown mustaches and constant giggles. Ethan drank slowly, feeling the warmth of the drink spread through his chest. Julia told funny stories about her nephews, made up bad jokes that made the girls roll their eyes but laugh anyway. When night came and the girls went to sleep, Ethan found Julia in the library again. She was curled up in the same armchair from days before, this time with a different book. He hesitated at the door. Julia looked up and smiled faintly. "Becoming a habit?" she asked. "I think so," Ethan admitted, coming in and sitting in the armchair across from her. They talked for hours that night. Ethan spoke about Eleanor, about how they met in college, about the early years of their marriage. Julia listened intently, asking the right questions at the right times. She shared stories about her own family, about growing up in Queens, about the challenges and joys of a simple life. Ethan realized he was relaxed in a way he hadn't been for months. Julia had that effect. She didn't judge, didn't offer easy solutions or empty words of comfort. She was just present, genuinely present, and that was more valuable than any expensive therapy he had tried. When they finally said goodnight and went to their separate rooms, Ethan lay down on the sofa in his study where he slept every night, and for the first time in 8 months slept without nightmares. The following weeks brought a transformation that Ethan could hardly believe. The triplets were changing before his eyes. It wasn't a dramatic change. It wasn't as if they had forgotten their mother or stopped missing her. It was something more subtle and more profound. They were becoming children again. Grace, the oldest by 7 minutes, started asking questions about everything. Why is the sky blue? Where does rain come from? How do birds learn to fly? Normal questions for a 5-year-old, but ones that had completely disappeared after Eleanor's passing. Now they were back in full force, bombarding both Ethan and Julia with endless curiosity. Emily, always the most artistic of the three, asked Julia to buy paints and brushes. She spent entire afternoons painting in the garden, creating abstract works full of vibrant colors that reminded him of the paintings Eleanor used to make. Ethan found one of these paintings drying in the yard, a whirlwind of purples and oranges that formed nothing specific but conveyed pure joy. He kept it carefully, hanging it in his study. Olivia, the youngest and most shy, started singing again, little songs she made up, nonsensical melodies full of life. Ethan heard her one morning in the shower, singing about a rabbit that had wings and flew to the moon. The sound passed through the walls and reached him in the hallway, making him stop and just listen, with his eyes closed and an involuntary smile on his lips. Ethan was changing too, though he wasn't fully aware of it. He started having dinner with the girls every night. At first he was quiet, just observing, but gradually he began to participate in the conversations, answering questions, telling stories about his own workday adapted so that 5-year-olds could understand. The triplets loved it when he tried to explain business concepts using toys and drawings. One Saturday morning, something rare happened. Ethan didn't go to the office. He just didn't go. He woke up early, but instead of putting on a suit and tie, he put on jeans and a casual shirt. He went down to the kitchen where he found Julia making coffee and pancakes. She looked at him, surprised. "No work today?" she asked. "No work today," he confirmed. Julia smiled. "The girls will be happy." And they were. When the triplets came down for breakfast and saw their father there, still in his pajamas and with disheveled hair, their little faces lit up. "Daddy's staying home?" Grace asked, incredulous. "I'm staying all day," Ethan replied. "What do you want to do?" The three of them started talking at once, suggesting 1,000 different activities. Julia laughed at the organized chaos. "One thing at a time, girls. Let's have breakfast first." After breakfast, Ethan found himself being dragged into the yard by his 3 daughters. Julia followed with a bag full of toys and art supplies. The day was perfect, sunny but not too hot, with a gentle breeze that rustled the leaves of the trees. The girls wanted to play hide-and-seek. Ethan accepted the challenge, though he couldn't remember the last time he had played anything. Julia was the one who counted while everyone ran to hide. Ethan squeezed himself behind a large bush, feeling ridiculous and wonderful at the same time. He could hear the girls' muffled giggles coming from different directions. Julia started searching, making exaggerated noises to give clues as to where she was. "Found Olivia!" she shouted, and Ethan heard more laughter. One by one, Julia found the triplets. Then she started looking for Ethan. He stayed very still behind the bush, trying to control his breathing. He could hear Julia's footsteps approaching, the girls' conspiratorial whispers giving hints. Suddenly a face appeared over the top of the bush. It was Emily, with a mischievous grin. "Found you, Daddy!" she shouted, triumphantly. Ethan feigned exaggerated surprise, making the girls laugh. "You got me," he admitted in surrender. They played for hours. Ethan ran, jumped, hid, and sought. His muscles complained about the unusual exercise, but he didn't care. The girls' laughter was the best medicine for any physical pain. At one point he tripped on purpose and fell onto the grass, making the triplets pile on top of him in a heap of arms and legs and joyous squeals. Julia took a photo with her phone without him noticing, capturing that moment of pure happiness. For lunch they ordered pizza. Ethan couldn't remember the last time he'd eaten pizza. Eleanor had loved pizza on Saturdays. It was a tradition. He had avoided the dish completely since she was gone, as if eating pizza without her was a betrayal. But now, sitting in the garden with his 3 daughters and Julia, eating slices of mozzarella and pepperoni, it felt right. It felt like Eleanor would approve. Grace licked melted cheese from her fingers and asked, "Daddy, did Mommy like pizza?" Ethan swallowed the piece he was chewing. "She loved it," he replied. "It was her favorite on Saturdays. She always ordered. Extra cheese." Emily tilted her head. "Just like me. Just like you," Ethan confirmed with a smile. "You got that from her." Julia observed the interaction in silence, a soft smile on her lips. She didn't intrude on these moments, just created space for them to happen naturally. Ethan noticed and felt a deep gratitude. Julia knew when to speak and when to be silent, when to participate and when to step back. It was a rare talent. In the afternoon, the girls asked to go to the park. The community had a full playground with swings, slides, and a wooden playhouse. Ethan agreed, though the park was full of painful memories. Eleanor used to take the girls there almost every day. She would spend hours pushing swings, helping them climb the slide, inventing elaborate games. Ethan rarely went along, always busy with work. Now walking to the park with Julia and the triplets, Ethan felt a mix of anxiety and determination. Other families were already there. Parents supervising children, couples pushing babies in strollers, grandparents sitting on benches watching their grandkids play. Ethan recognized a few neighbors who nodded politely. Some looked at him with pity, others with curiosity. Everyone knew what had happened to Eleanor. It was the kind of news that spread quickly in a gated community. The triplets ran straight for the swings. Julia followed them, starting to push one at a time. Ethan stood a little way off, watching. Grace shouted to go higher. Emily laughed every time the swing went up. Olivia closed her eyes and smiled, feeling the wind on her face. They were just children being children. Happy, alive, free. A woman approached Ethan. It was Susan, a neighbor who lived 3 houses down. She and Eleanor had been friends. "Ethan, it's so good to see you here," she said with genuine kindness. "And the girls look so well." Ethan nodded, not trusting his voice. Susan looked at Julia. "Is this the new nanny?" "Yes," Ethan replied. "Julia, she's been incredible with the girls." Susan smiled. "I can see that. They're radiant. You must be so relieved." "I am," Ethan admitted. "More than I can say." Susan briefly placed a hand on his arm. "Eleanor would be happy," she said softly. "Seeing them like this. Seeing you trying." The words hit Ethan like a well-aimed arrow. Eleanor would be happy. Could it be true? He wanted to believe it was. "Thank you, Susan," he managed to say. She smiled and walked away to look after her own children. Ethan walked over to the swings. Julia was pushing Olivia, who was laughing with total abandon. "Can I try?" Ethan asked. Julia stepped away immediately, giving him space. Ethan held the swing's chains and pushed gently. Olivia looked over her shoulder and smiled at him. "Harder, Daddy," she requested. Ethan pushed harder, watching his daughter fly higher and higher. The sound of her laughter was pure music. One by one, Ethan pushed all three girls. His arms grew tired, but it was a good kind of tired, productive, meaningful. When the triplets finally tired of the swings and went to explore the wooden playhouse, Ethan sat on the bench next to Julia. "You're good at this," she commented. Ethan gave a humorless laugh. "I'm not. I'm learning." "We're all always learning," Julia said. "What's important is being willing." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the girls play. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Ethan thought of Eleanor, of how she loved sunsets. She used to stop whatever she was doing to watch them, saying that each one was unique and deserved attention. He had never fully understood, always too busy to stop. Now he understood. Now he saw the beauty she had seen. The girls came running back, tired and happy, sweaty and with their clothes dirty from dirt and grass. Eleanor would have been horrified, Ethan thought with a smile. She was a bit of a neat freak, but she also would have loved to see her daughters so completely lost in play. "Shall we go home?" Julia suggested. The girls complained but didn't resist much. They were clearly exhausted. Ethan carried Olivia in his arms on the walk back. The girl rested her head on his shoulder, almost asleep. The small, warm weight against his chest was comforting in a way he didn't know he needed. The shift between Ethan and Julia happened so gradually that neither of them noticed exactly when the line was crossed, when the professional relationship of employer and employee began to transform into something deeper and more complex. But it happened silent and inevitable as the sunrise. Ethan started looking for excuses to spend time in the same room as Julia. He would bring work to the kitchen when she was preparing meals. He would sit in the garden when she was playing with the girls outside. He would invent questions about the triplets that could easily wait, just to have a reason to talk to her. Julia never commented, just answered with her characteristic tranquility, but Ethan sometimes caught a glint in her eyes that suggested she noticed. One Sunday night, after the girls were asleep, Ethan found Julia on the back porch. She was sitting on a lounge chair looking at the city lights in the distance. She had a thin blanket over her shoulders because the night was cooler than usual. Ethan hesitated at the door, wondering if he should interrupt her moment of solitude, but Julia turned her head and smiled, as if she had been waiting for him. "May I?" he asked, gesturing to the lounge chair beside hers. "Of course," she replied. Ethan sat down, adjusting himself on the wooden furniture. They were silent for a while, just watching the night. New York City stretched out before them in an endless carpet of twinkling lights. From that height it was easy to forget the chaos and violence that pulsed through the streets. It looked almost peaceful. "Do you miss home?" Ethan asked suddenly. Julia thought for a moment. "Sometimes," she admitted. "But I talk to my family on the phone every day, and they come to visit every now and then." "Does your mother still live in Queens?" "Yes, in the same house where I grew up. She never wanted to leave, even when I offered to help her find something better." Ethan nodded, understanding that kind of attachment. Eleanor had been the same way with her childhood home in Maple Creek. She would visit her parents every month, bringing the triplets, filling the modest house with laughter and life. Eleanor's parents had been devastated when she passed. Ethan rarely saw them now, the pain of looking at each other being too much. They saw Eleanor in their granddaughters' faces. He saw Eleanor in everything. "Julia, can I ask you something?" Ethan said, turning to look at her. She met his gaze. "Of course. Why do you do this? Why work with families going through difficult times? It would be so much easier to work with normal families, without all this emotional baggage." Julia was quiet for so long that Ethan thought she wouldn't answer. Then she began to speak, her voice low but firm. "After my sister passed, My family fell apart. Everyone dealt with the pain differently, and none of those ways included talking to each other. My dad threw himself into work, staying out of the house 16 hours a day. My mom cleaned obsessively, as if she could scrub the pain away. I shut myself in my room, stopped eating, talking, living. Ethan listened in silence, feeling the weight of her story. It was my grandmother who saved me, Julia continued. She just showed up one day, came into my room, opened the curtains, and said it was time to start feeling again. She made me talk about my sister, made me tell stories, remember the good times, cry about the bad. She wasn't afraid of my pain. And that gave me permission not to be afraid either. Julia pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders. When I started working with children, I realized I had a gift for it. Not because I'm especially talented or trained, but simply because I'm not afraid of their pain. I can be present without running away. And I discovered that's what children need most. Someone who stays. Someone who doesn't fall apart when they fall apart. Ethan felt a lump in his throat. You stayed, he said, his voice rough with emotion. When the others ran, you stayed. Julia looked him directly in the eye. Your daughters deserve someone who stays. All children do. The simple truth of those words hit Ethan deeply. He thought of the 3 previous nannies who had quit, saying the emotional weight was too much. He thought of how he himself had run, burying himself in work instead of facing his daughter's pain. Julia was the only one who hadn't run. Thank you, he whispered, for staying, for not being afraid, for giving my daughters back to me. Julia shook her head gently. You gave them back to yourself. I just helped open the door. You were the one who chose to walk through it. Ethan wasn't sure if that was true, but he wanted to believe it. He wanted to believe he was finally doing something right. They stayed on the porch late, talking about everything and nothing. Julia told funny stories about her nephews, about chaotic family parties where everyone talked at once. Ethan shared memories from his college days, of when he met Eleanor and how she had challenged him to be more than just an ambitious businessman. When they finally said goodnight and each went to bed, Ethan realized he was smiling, a small but real smile. The following days brought a growing intimacy that both frightened and comforted Ethan. He found himself watching Julia when she wasn't looking, the way she tied her hair up when she was cooking, how she bit her lower lip when she was concentrating, the way her eyes lit up when the girls said something funny. Little details he memorized without realizing it. One Wednesday afternoon, Ethan came home and found no one in the living room or garden. He heard voices coming from the Triplets' room. He went up the stairs silently and stopped at the ajar door. Julia was sitting on Grace's bed with the 3 girls around her. She was holding a picture frame with a photo of Eleanor. The girls were telling stories about their mother, fragments of memories they were keeping alive. Mommy used to sing in the car, Olivia was saying. Emily added, and she made heart-shaped pancakes on Sundays. Grace completed, she smelled like flowers and always gave 3 goodnight kisses, one for each of us. Julia listened to every word with total attention, asking questions, keeping Eleanor's memory alive through her daughters. Ethan felt his eyes burn. Julia was doing what he couldn't. She was honoring Eleanor by keeping her presence real and accessible for the girls. He knocked lightly on the door. The 4 of them turned to look at him. "Daddy!" the girls shouted in unison. Julia smiled. "We were just talking about your mum," she explained without embarrassment. Ethan entered the room and sat on the bed, joining the circle. "Can I listen too?" The girls began to repeat their stories, now for their father. Ethan added his own memories, how Eleanor burned almost everything she tried to cook, but her pancakes were perfect. How she danced around the house when she cleaned, using the broom as a microphone. How she laughed so hard at her own jokes that she could never finish telling them. The Triplets laughed at these stories, absorbing every detail. Julia watched the scene with quiet satisfaction. When the stories ended, and the girls went downstairs to play, Ethan and Julia remained in the room. "You have a gift," Ethan said, "for keeping her memory alive without it being too painful." Julia placed the picture frame back on the nightstand. "Memories are gifts," she said. "We shouldn't hold on to them as if they were wounds. We should celebrate them." Ethan moved closer to her without thinking. "Julia, I don't know how to thank you for everything you've done, for everything you continue to do. Julia looked at him, her dark eyes serious. You don't have to thank me. Being here helping your daughters is a privilege. But it's not just about the girls, Ethan said, his voice lower. You're helping me too, helping me heal, to become human again. Julia became very still. The space between them seemed charged with electricity. Ethan realized how close they were. He could see every detail of her face, the light freckles on her nose, the subtle streaks of gold in her brown eyes, the perfect shape of her lips. His heart raced. He leaned in slightly, almost without conscious control. Julia didn't pull away, but she didn't move closer either. She just stood there, waiting. Grace's voice, shouting from downstairs, broke the moment. "Daddy! Julia, come see!" Ethan quickly pulled back, aware that he had almost crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Julia blinked and gave a slightly shaky smile. "We'd better see what she wants." "Yes," Ethan agreed, his voice hoarse. They went downstairs together, but something had changed. There was a new tension between them, an awareness of possibilities that hadn't existed before. The girls had set up an impromptu theater performance in the living room using sheets and pillows. They wanted Ethan and Julia to watch. They sat side by side on the sofa as the triplets acted out a confusing but adorable story about princesses and dragons. Ethan was hyper-aware of Julia's presence beside him. He could feel the warmth of her body, hear her breathing, notice every small movement. It was dangerous, this growing feeling. Complicated, potentially destructive, but it was there, undeniable and powerful, refusing to be ignored. The awareness of what was happening hit Ethan like a lightning bolt on a Tuesday morning. He was in an important meeting with Japanese investors, discussing a $50 million merger, when he realized he couldn't concentrate. His mind was at home, imagining what Julia and the girls were doing at that moment. Imagining her smile, the sound of her voice, the way she tilted her head when listening to the triplets' stories. The realization stunned him. He was developing feelings for Julia, feelings that went beyond gratitude or friendship, feelings he had no right to have, considering Eleanor had been gone for only 9 months. What was happening to him? How could he even think of another woman when his wife, the mother of his daughters, was still so present in every corner of the house? Ethan excused himself from the meeting, claiming an emergency, and left the office in a hurry. He didn't go home. He drove aimlessly through New York City, crossing the city from end to end, trying to organize the chaotic thoughts in his mind. Was it a betrayal to feel this? Was it wrong? Eleanor was gone, but he didn't feel she had truly left. Her presence was still too tangible, too real. He ended up parking in a cemetery in Greenwich, not the cemetery where Eleanor was, but another one. He sat there in the car, looking at the headstones through the windshield. How many people in there had left spouses behind? How long did it take until it was acceptable to move on? Was there a timeline for grief, rules that determined when it was appropriate to feel something for another person again? His phone rang. It was his mother-in-law, Margaret. Ethan hesitated but answered. "Ethan, dear, how are you?" Her voice was gentle, concerned. "I'm fine, Margaret," he lied. "And you?" She sighed. "Surviving. Each day a little easier, a little harder. You understand?" Yes, he understood perfectly. "Is there something you need?" she asked. No, Ethan said quickly. "Just wanted to check on you." A lie. He hadn't called. She had. But Margaret didn't point it out. "How are my granddaughters?" she asked, and Ethan heard the longing in her voice. "They're well. Very well, actually. Julia is doing an amazing job with them." Silence on the other end. Then Margaret said, "I'm glad I hired her. I had a feeling she would be good for the girls." "You were right," Ethan said. "She's perfect for them." Another pause. "And what about you?" Margaret asked softly. "How are you, Ethan, really?" The question caught him off guard. No one asked how he really was. Everyone assumed he was fine because he kept functioning, working, keeping life moving. But Margaret knew better. She had lost her daughter. She knew that pain didn't respect appearances. "I'm confused," he finally admitted. confused about a lot of things. Margaret was quiet for a moment. If you want to talk, I'm here. I always will be. Thanks, Margaret. I'll bring the girls to visit you soon. They'd like that. I'd like that too. When he hung up, Ethan felt a little less alone, but the confusion remained. He drove back home, arriving in the middle of the afternoon. He found Julia and the triplets in the kitchen making cookies. Flour covered practically every surface, and the four of them were laughing about something that had happened. When they saw Ethan, the girls ran to hug him, leaving floury handprints on his expensive suit. He didn't care. Julia wiped her hands on the apron she was wearing. "You're home early," she observed. "Meeting was cancelled." Ethan lied again. It seemed he was lying a lot lately. Julia looked at him in a way that suggested she didn't quite believe him, but she didn't press. "Want to help?" "Make cookies," she offered. The girls started begging him to stay. How could Ethan refuse? He took off his jacket, rolled up his shirt sleeves, and joined them at the kitchen island. Julia explained the process, her skilled hands demonstrating how to shape the dough. Ethan tried to copy her, but his cookies came out misshapen and strange. The girls found it hilarious. Emily said his cookie looked like an alien. Grace said it looked like a shoe. Olivia just laughed until she couldn't stand up anymore. Julia smiled, her eyes twinkling with amusement. "You have hidden talents," she teased. "Cookie making is clearly not one of them." Ethan laughed at himself, something he hadn't done in so long he had almost forgotten how. Eleanor used to mock his attempts to help in the kitchen too. She'd say he was a business genius, but an absolute disaster with anything related to food. The memory brought a pang of pain, but it wasn't unbearable. It was almost sweet, a gentle nostalgia instead of a deep cut. After the cookies went into the oven, the girls went to play in the living room. Julia started cleaning up the mess in the kitchen. Ethan helped without being asked, wiping down the flour-covered counter. They worked in comfortable silence for a few minutes. Then Ethan said, without looking at her, "Julia, can I ask you a personal question?" She stopped washing the bowl she was holding. "Of course." "Have you ever been in a serious relationship?" he asked, surprised by his own boldness. Julia was quiet for a moment. "I had a boyfriend for 3 years," she said finally. "We broke up 2 years ago." "Why did you break up?" Ethan asked, knowing he was being nosy but unable to stop. Julia rinsed the bowl before answering. "He wanted me to stop working with grieving families. He said it was too heavy, that it made me too sad. He wanted me to be a regular school teacher with normal kids, no emotional baggage." "And you didn't want to?" Ethan asked. "I couldn't," Julia replied simply. "This work is part of who I am. I can't just turn off the part of me that understands pain and loss." He couldn't accept that, so we broke up. Ethan nodded slowly, processing that information. He felt an inappropriate sense of relief knowing she was single. "What about you?" Julia asked, turning to look at him. "You and Eleanor, were you happy?" The question should have been difficult, but it wasn't. "We were," Ethan said honestly. "Very happy. She was my best friend, my partner in everything. We completed each other in ways I didn't even know were possible. When she left, it was like half of me went with her." Julia watched him with full attention. "And now?" she asked softly. "How do you feel now?" Ethan met her eyes. "Now I feel like maybe I'm finding parts of myself I thought were lost forever, thanks to you." The air between them became charged again, as it had in the girls' room days before. Julia opened her mouth to reply, but the oven timer went off, breaking the moment. She turned quickly to take out the cookies, and Ethan let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The girls came running back when they smelled the baked cookies. They ate them while they were still hot, burning their tongues and not caring. Ethan watched his daughters, so different from the scared, silent children of a few months ago. They were happy now, not completely, not yet. The shadow of their mother's loss was still there, probably always would be. But they could be happy despite it. They could laugh, play, live. Julia had made that happen. That night, after the girls were asleep, Ethan stayed awake in his study, trying to work, but unable to concentrate. Around 11, he heard a soft knock on the door. "Come in," he said. Julia entered, looking hesitant. "Sorry to bother you," she said. "I saw the light on." "You're not bothering me," Ethan said quickly, gesturing to the armchair in front of his desk. "Sit." Julia sat on the edge of the armchair, her hands in her lap. "Ethan, we need to talk," she began. He felt his heart sink. Those words were never good. "About what?" he asked, though he had a suspicion. "About what's happening between us," Julia said directly, without beating around the bush. "I feel like there's something. And if I'm wrong, I'm sorry, but I need to be clear about professional boundaries." Ethan closed his laptop, giving her his full attention. "You're not wrong," he admitted. "There is something. I don't know exactly what it is or when it started, but it's there, and it scares me because I don't know if it's appropriate, if it's right, if it's fair to Eleanor or to you or to the girls." Julia nodded understandingly. "It scares me too," she confessed, "because I came here to help your daughters, not to complicate things. And I'm afraid it's too soon for you, that you're confusing gratitude with something else." "It's not gratitude," Ethan said firmly. "Or at least, it's not just that. You make me feel alive again, Julia. You make me feel like maybe there's a future beyond this endless grief, and that's terrifying and wonderful at the same time." Julia looked at him for a long moment. "I don't know what to do with that," she admitted. "I don't want to disrespect your wife's memory. I don't want to confuse the girls, but I also don't know how to ignore what I feel when I'm near you." Her confession left him breathless, so it wasn't just him. She felt it too. "What do we do?" he asked. Julia shook her head. "I don't know. Maybe we should go slow. Very slow. See what happens naturally without forcing anything." Ethan agreed, though a part of him wanted to skip all the steps and just be with her already. But Julia was right. They had to be careful. For the girls, for Eleanor's memory, for themselves. The following weeks were a delicate dance of approach and retreat. Ethan and Julia had established a tacit agreement to go slow, but the tension between them was palpable. Every accidental touch as they passed each other in the hallway sent electric currents down Ethan's spine. Every prolonged glance during dinner made Julia blush slightly. The triplets, thankfully, seemed oblivious to it all, absorbed in their own world of play and discovery. Ethan began to participate more actively in the girls' routine. He woke up earlier to have breakfast with them before going to the office. He always arrived before 7 in the evening to have dinner together. He read stories to them before bed, using different voices for each character like Julia did. The girls loved it, laughing at their father's exaggerated imitations. One Friday night, after putting the triplets to bed, Ethan went downstairs to find Julia tidying up the kitchen. She was wearing a simple blue cotton dress, a change from the jeans and shirts she usually wore. Ethan stopped at the door, watching her for a moment. She was humming softly as she put away clean dishes, completely at ease. There was something deeply attractive about that natural domesticity. "Going out?" he asked, making her turn in surprise. Julia smiled. "My friend Sarah is having a birthday. I thought I'd go visit her for a few hours if that's not a problem." "Of course it's not a problem," Ethan said quickly. "You deserve a night off." Julia hesitated. "The girls are already asleep. Will you be okay on your own?" Ethan laughed. "I think I can survive a few hours. Go, have fun." Julia finished tidying the kitchen, grabbed a small purse and headed for the door. On the threshold, she turned. Ethan was leaning against the counter, watching her. "Thank you," she said softly, "for trusting me with your daughters, for letting me be a part of their lives." "I should be the one thanking you," Ethan replied, his voice thick with emotion. "For everything." Julia smiled, a small smile that lit up her whole face. Then she left, leaving Ethan alone in the large house. Ethan wandered aimlessly through the mansion, feeling strangely lost without Julia's presence. It was ridiculous. He lived here. It was his house. But in recent months, Julia had become such a part of the fabric of the place that her absence created a noticeable void. He went up to check on the girls. The three were sleeping soundly, their identical faces relaxed and peaceful. Grace was hugging a teddy bear. Emily had the blanket pulled up to her chin. Olivia was sleeping on her side, one hand under her cheek. Ethan sat in the rocking chair in the corner of the room, the same chair where Eleanor had spent hours rocking. the babies when they were newborns. He watched his daughters sleep, something he rarely did. They were growing up so fast. Soon they would be 6, then 7, 8, 10. Time stopped for no one, not even for grief. Eleanor was missing all of this. Every important milestone, every little change. And as much as it hurt to admit, life went on without her. His phone vibrated in his pocket. It was a text from his mother-in-law, Margaret. Thinking of the girls. How are they? Ethan replied quickly. They're great. Sleeping now. Want to video call tomorrow? The reply came, almost immediately. I'd love that. I miss my granddaughters. Ethan smiled. Deal then, 10 in the morning. Perfect. Thank you, Ethan, for taking such good care of them, for honoring my daughter by being a good father. The words touched Ethan deeply. Margaret had no idea how inadequate he felt as a father, how Julia did all the heavy emotional lifting. But maybe just being present was something. Maybe trying was enough. He went down to the library, picked up a book Eleanor had loved, a collection of short stories by a famous author, and tried to read. But words blurred on the page, his mind constantly returning to Julia. Where was she now? Was she having fun? Was she thinking of him? At 11 o'clock he heard the front door open. Julia came in quietly, taking off her shoes in the hall. Ethan appeared at the library door. How was it? He asked. Julia seemed surprised to find him awake. It was good. Sarah loved the surprise. Ethan nodded. Want some tea? Julia hesitated, then nodded. I'd love some. They went to the kitchen together. Ethan prepared chamomile tea while Julia sat at the island watching. How long? Have you and Sarah been friends? He asked, trying to keep the conversation light. Since we were teenagers. We grew up on the same street. Julia accepted the cup he offered, thanking him with a smile. She was the one who supported me when my sister passed. She stayed with me on nights when I couldn't stop crying, forced me to eat when I didn't want to, saved my life in a way. Ethan sat next to her. You're lucky to have a friend like that. I am, Julia agreed. And she's happy for me now. She says I'm different, lighter, as if a weight has been lifted from my shoulders. Are you? Ethan asked. Julia looked him in the eyes. I am. This job, this house, your daughters, all of it is healing me as much as I hope I'm healing you. Ethan held the teacup with both hands, feeling the warmth through the porcelain. Julia, I need to tell you something. She waited, attentive. Today, while you were out, I realized something. This house is huge, full of rooms and luxuries, but without you here it felt empty. And that scares me because I don't know if it's healthy to feel so dependent on another person so quickly. Not after Eleanor. Julia placed her cup on the counter. I don't think it's about replacing Eleanor, she said carefully. I think it's about learning that the human heart has infinite capacity. Loving someone new doesn't diminish the love you had for your wife. It doesn't erase her memory. It just adds something new alongside the old. Ethan wanted to believe that. He wanted to believe it was possible to honor Eleanor and still move forward. But guilt was a constant companion, whispering in his ear that it was too soon, too wrong, too cruel. Margaret wants to video call with the girls tomorrow, Ethan said, changing the subject. Julia smiled. That's great. The girls love talking to their grandma. You can join too, Ethan offered. If you want. Julia shook her head slightly. It's a family moment. I shouldn't intrude. You're part of this family now, Ethan said with intensity. Whether you like it or not, you've become an essential part of it. The silence that followed was heavy with meaning. Julia looked away first, finishing her tea in a long gulp. It's late, she said, standing up. I should get to sleep. Ethan stood up too. Julia. She stopped at the kitchen door, looking over her shoulder. Thank you for coming back, for not giving up on us. I'll never give up, she said softly. I promise. And then she went upstairs, leaving Ethan alone with his conflicting thoughts and his confused heart. On Saturday morning, Ethan woke up to the girls jumping on his bed. Technically, it was the sofa in his study where he slept every night, still unable to return to the bedroom he had shared with Eleanor. "Daddy, Daddy, we're going to call Grandma," Grace shouted, excited. Ethan sat up, rubbing his eyes. "What time is it?" 9:30, Emily informed him with the seriousness of someone very important. "Julia said not to wake you, but we couldn't wait." Ethan laughed, still groggy with sleep. All right, let's get ready then." The girls ran off, shouting that they were going to pick out pretty clothes for Grandma to see. Ethan stood up, stretching his sore muscles. He needed to buy a better sofa, or better yet, go back to his own bed. But the idea of sleeping in that room, in that bed, without Eleanor, was still too much. He found Julia in the kitchen making breakfast. She was wearing sweatpants and a simple t-shirt, her hair in a messy bun. She looked younger like this, almost vulnerable. "Sorry about the girls," she said. "I tried to make them wait." Ethan shook his head. "It's fine, it was time to wake up anyway." He poured himself some coffee and sat at the table. "Have the girls eaten?" "They have. They're in their room getting ready." Julia turned to look at him. "Are you sure you want me to be on the call?" "I'm sure," Ethan said firmly. "Margaret needs to meet you. She needs to see who's taking care of her granddaughters." Julia looked nervous but nodded. "Okay." At 10 o'clock sharp, they gathered in the living room with Ethan's laptop on his lap. The triplets squeezed onto the sofa next to him, excited and talkative. Julia sat in a nearby armchair, trying to stay out of the frame. Ethan made the video call, and in seconds, Margaret's face appeared on the screen. "My beautiful granddaughters," Margaret exclaimed, her eyes instantly filling with tears. "You're all so big." The girls started talking all at once, telling her about their games, the cookies, the trips to the park. Margaret listened with full attention, smiling through her tears. Her gaze passed over Ethan, who waved, and then landed on Julia, partially visible in the background. "You must be Julia," Margaret said. "Come, let me see you properly." Julia hesitated but moved closer, coming into the camera's frame. "Hello, Mrs. Margaret," she said respectfully. "It's a pleasure to meet you, even virtually." Margaret studied her for a long moment. Then she smiled, a genuine and warm smile. "The pleasure is all mine, dear. I want to thank you for taking such good care of my granddaughters. Ethan tells me you've worked wonders for them." Julia blushed slightly. "I'm just doing my job. They're incredible girls. They make everything easy." The triplets took over the conversation again, showing drawings they had made, singing songs they had learned, telling elaborate stories. Margaret drank in every word, every gesture, clearly missing them terribly. "When can I visit?" she finally asked. The girls started begging. "Today, tomorrow, now," Ethan laughed. "How about next week?" Margaret accepted immediately, arranging the details. Margaret's visit was scheduled for the following Wednesday. Ethan realized he was nervous in a way that didn't make sense. It was his mother-in-law, someone he had known for years, who had supported him unconditionally after Eleanor's passing. But now Julia was in the equation, and Ethan didn't know how Margaret would react to seeing the closeness between them. Not that anything was officially happening, but anyone with eyes could see the tension, the connection, the unspoken thing that hung between them. Julia seemed nervous too. Ethan found her on Wednesday morning cleaning the house obsessively, even though the mansion was already impeccable. The maids, who came 3 times a week, took care of everything, but Julia was fluffing pillows, rearranging flowers, checking for dust in impossible places. "Everything's perfect," Ethan said, lightly touching her arm. Julia jumped, clearly tense. "I want to make a good impression." "She already likes you," Ethan assured her. "You talked on the video call, remember?" But Julia wouldn't calm down. Finally, she stopped in the middle of the living room and looked at Ethan. "Does she know?" she asked abruptly. "Know what?" Ethan asked, though he knew exactly what she was talking about. "About us. About whatever this is between us." Ethan sighed. "There's nothing definitive to know. We're just 2 people who care about each other and are trying to figure out what to do with it." Julia frowned. "But she'll notice. Mothers always notice these things, and she might think it's disrespectful to Eleanor's memory." Ethan took her hands, making her stop fidgeting nervously. "Julia, look at me." She obeyed, her dark eyes anxious. Margaret is a wise and understanding woman. If she notices anything, she won't judge. She just wants her granddaughters to be happy. And you've made them happy. That's what matters to her. Julia didn't seem entirely convinced, but nodded, taking a deep breath to calm herself. Margaret arrived at noon sharp. A rideshare driver dropped her off in front of the mansion, and the triplets ran out the door screaming before the car had even fully stopped. "Grandma! Grandma!" Margaret got out with difficulty, her 65 years weighing on her knees, but her face was radiant. She knelt with effort and opened her arms, hugging all 3 granddaughters at once. "My loves! How you've grown! How beautiful you are!" Ethan watched from the porch, a smile touching his lips. Margaret was a strong woman. She had survived the loss of her only child with a grace he envied. She stood up with the girls' help, picked up a small suitcase she had brought, and walked toward the house. Ethan came down the steps to hug her. "Margaret, it's so good to have you here." She hugged him tightly. "Ethan, my dear, you look well, better than I expected." He pulled back, surprised. "I do?" "You look lighter," she said, studying his face. "Less tormented. It's good to see." Julia appeared at the door, nervously wiping her hands on her apron. Margaret approached her with a warm smile. "Julia, we finally get to meet in person." "Thank you for having me, Mrs. Margaret," Julia said respectfully. "The girls talk so much about you." Margaret took Julia's hands in hers. "And they talk so much about you too. They say you're magic, that you make cookies disappear and sadness vanish." Julia laughed, relaxing a little. "Children's exaggeration. I just do what I can." "You're doing a lot," Margaret said with sincerity. Lunch was cheerful and loud. The triplets vied for their grandmother's attention, all talking at once. Margaret listened patiently, asking questions, laughing at their stories. Julia served a stew she had spent the morning preparing, and everyone ate until they couldn't anymore. After lunch, the girls dragged Margaret to the garden to show her the flowers, the special rocks they collected, the new slide Ethan had installed. Ethan and Julia stayed in the kitchen cleaning up. "She likes you," Ethan commented. Julia rinsed a plate. "I'm still nervous. I don't know why." "Maybe because her approval matters to you," Ethan said. "And you want her to approve, not just as a nanny, but as," he hesitated, "as an important person in the girls' lives." "And in yours," Julia completed quietly. "And in mine," Ethan confirmed. Later, when the girls were busy with Margaret in their room showing her their toys, Margaret came down to the living room where Ethan was working on his laptop. "May I?" she asked, indicating the armchair. "Of course, sit." Margaret settled in with a sigh. "These girls have endless energy. I forgot what it's like to be 5. Ethan smiled. "You've always been great with them. Eleanor used to say she was jealous of your patience." Eleanor's name hung in the air between them. Margaret was quiet for a moment, then said, "Can I speak frankly with you, Ethan?" "You always can." Margaret leaned forward. "Julia is special, I can see that. And I also see the way you look at her, the way she looks at you." Ethan felt blood rush to his face. "Margaret, it's not," he began, but she held up a hand. "Let me finish. My daughter has been gone for 10 months. 10 months that must have felt like an eternity to you. And I know, because I feel the same, that part of you feels any step forward is a betrayal. But it's not, Ethan. Eleanor wouldn't want you to be stuck in grief forever. She loved you too much for that." Ethan felt his eyes burn. "How do you know I'm ready?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "How does anyone know they're ready to live again?" "You don't," Margaret said gently. "No one ever does. But the heart has ways of telling us when it's time, and your heart is clearly saying something about Julia." Tears threatened to fall, and Ethan blinked hard to hold them back. "I'm afraid the girls will be confused. I'm afraid of replacing Eleanor in their memory. I'm afraid of messing everything up." Margaret stood up and walked over to him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You can't replace Eleanor. No one can. She will always be their mother, will always have that special place. But the girls need love, Ethan. They need to see that it's possible to be happy again. Julia is teaching them that. And maybe she's teaching you too." Ethan covered Margaret's hand with his. "Thank you," he said simply. Margaret smiled. Just don't take too long to act. Life is too short to waste time on fear. Trust me, I learned that the hard way. With those words, she returned to the girls' room, leaving Ethan with much to think about. That night, after Margaret had gone to sleep in the guest room and the triplets had finally surrendered to sleep, Ethan sought out Julia. He found her on the back porch, as he had so many times before, watching the city lights. "Can I join you?" he asked. Julia nodded. Ethan sat beside her, so close he could feel the warmth of her body. "I talked to Margaret today," he began. Julia turned to look at him. About us," Ethan admitted. Or rather, she talked. "And I listened." "What did she say?" Julia asked cautiously. "She said it's okay, that Eleanor wouldn't want me to be stuck in grief, that the heart has ways of telling us when it's time to move on." Ethan paused. "And she told me not to waste time on fear." Julia was very still. "And do you agree with her?" Ethan turned completely to face her. I'm trying to believe that I can honor Eleanor and still let you in. That it's not a choice between the past and the future, but finding a way to have both." Julia took his hand, lacing her fingers through his. "I don't want you to feel like you have to choose. I don't want to rush anything." Ethan squeezed her hand. "But what if I want to rush? What if I'm tired of being afraid? What if I just want to be with you without all this guilt and hesitation?" Julia smiled, a small but hopeful smile. "Then maybe it's time to stop thinking so much and start feeling. Let it happen naturally." Ethan leaned in, slowly enough to give her time to pull back if she wanted. But Julia didn't pull back. She stayed there, waiting, her eyes on his. When their lips finally touched, it was soft, hesitant, full of unspoken promises and shared fears. It was a kiss that said everything words couldn't, a kiss that acknowledged the pain of the past, but opened up to the possibility of the future. When they pulled apart, they were both breathing unevenly. Julia rested her forehead against his. "This changes everything," she whispered. "I know," Ethan said, "and it's okay. We're in this together now." The days following the kiss were a strange mix of cautious happiness and growing anxiety. Ethan and Julia no longer hid the connection between them, but they didn't openly announce it either. They maintained an appropriate physical distance in front of the girls, but their glances said everything. A shared smile across the dinner table, fingers that brushed when passing a dish, a silent intimacy that was there for anyone who cared to look. The triplets seemed to notice nothing different. To them, Julia had always been part of the family, and seeing their father happy was just another positive change in a series of changes that had improved their lives. Grace commented one night that Daddy laughed more now. Emily said the house didn't feel sad anymore. Olivia just hugged Ethan tightly and said she loved him. Every word was a gift he treasured. But not everything was perfect. Ethan began to notice curious glances from neighbors when they walked through the community. Whispers circulated. The rich widower already had a new girlfriend. How quickly he got over it. Is she after his money? The words weren't spoken directly to him, but they reached him through veiled comments, poorly disguised expressions of surprise and awkward silences when he entered a room. One Saturday afternoon, Ethan took the girls to the community club to swim. Julia accompanied them, wearing a simple black one-piece swimsuit that made Ethan forget how to breathe. The triplets splashed in the kiddie pool, shouting and laughing. Ethan and Julia sat on nearby lounge chairs watching. They were talking about plans for the week when a female voice interrupted them. "Ethan?" He turned and saw Brenda, a friend of Eleanor's from college. She lived in the community, and the two used to go for walks together. Ethan hadn't seen her since the funeral. "Brenda, hi," he said, standing up politely. "How are you?" She hugged him briefly, but her gaze was fixed on Julia. "I'm fine, and you seem to be doing very well." Her tone had an edge that Ethan couldn't quite identify. "I'm better," Ethan answered honestly. "The girls are better too." Brenda finally shifted her gaze from Julia to look at the triplets in the pool. "I can see that. They're radiant." After an uncomfortable pause, Ethan said, "This is Julia. She looks after the girls. Julia extended her hand politely. Nice to meet you. Brenda shook it coolly. Pleasure. Eleanor told me a lot about the girls. We were very close, you know. I know, Julia said calmly. The girls mention you sometimes. Brenda raised an eyebrow. Oh, do they? How interesting. Julia didn't back down under the scrutiny. Ethan felt the tension grow. Brenda finally turned her attention back to him. You should have lunch with me sometime, Ethan. We can talk. About Eleanor. About how things have changed. Her tone made it clear that the conversation would not be pleasant. Ethan kept his voice firm. Sure, we can arrange something. Brenda gave Julia one last look before walking away. It was nice meeting you, she said, but her tone said the opposite. When she was gone, Julia let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She didn't like me. Ethan sat down next to her again. She's protecting Eleanor's memory. She believes any change is a betrayal. Julia looked down at her hands. Maybe she's right. Maybe it is too soon. Maybe people see this and judge you. Judge the girls. Ethan took her hand, even knowing Brenda was probably still watching from a distance. I don't care what people think. I care about what's right for me and for my daughters. And you are right, Julia, I'm sure of it. Julia squeezed his hand, but the worry didn't leave her eyes. The encounter with Brenda cast a shadow over the rest of the day. Even after returning home, playing with the girls, preparing dinner, the tension remained. That night, after the triplets were asleep, Julia was unusually quiet. Ethan found her in the kitchen, staring out the window into the dark night. Are you thinking about what Brenda said? He asked. Julia turned. I'm thinking about a lot of things, about how people see this, about how it could affect the girls if there's judgment, about whether I'm being selfish by letting this continue. Ethan walked over to her. You're not being selfish. We both deserve a chance to be happy. But what about the girls? Julia insisted. What if someone says something at school when they start? What if other kids make mean comments about their father already having a new girlfriend? What if it hurts them? Ethan didn't have easy answers. They were valid concerns, legitimate fears. We'll deal with it when it comes, he said finally. Together. Julia shook her head. I don't know if I'm strong. Say enough to face the judgment of the whole world. You're stronger than you think, Ethan said. You didn't run from my daughter's grief. You won't run from a few gossips either. But Julia didn't seem convinced. The seed of doubt had been planted by Brenda and was growing rapidly. Ethan could see it in her eyes, in the way she subtly pulled away from him, as if already preparing to let go. Don't do this, he pleaded. Don't pull away from me now. Julia looked at him with conflicted eyes. I'm not pulling away, I'm just being realistic. Maybe we should go slower, much slower. Think more about the consequences. Ethan felt frustration build in his chest. We're already going slow. It's been months since anything happened between us. How much slower can we go? Julia didn't answer, and the silence was more eloquent than any word. Ethan realized he was losing her, losing something precious he had barely begun to have. Please, he said, his voice breaking slightly, don't let other people's fears destroy this. Don't let Brenda or anyone else decide what's right for us. Julia closed her eyes, tears streaming down her cheeks. It's not just their fears. It's mine too. I'm afraid of hurting your daughters. I'm afraid of being seen as the woman who took advantage of your vulnerability. I'm afraid I'll wake up one day and you'll realize you made a mistake, that it was too fast, that you still love Eleanor too much to have room for me. Ethan wiped her tears with his thumbs. I will always love Eleanor, but my heart isn't a finite space. There's room for both, for the past and the future. Julia opened her eyes, looking deeply into his. How are you so sure? No, this isn't just gratitude or loneliness or the first available comfort after the storm. Because I know the difference, Ethan said firmly. Because when I look at you, I see more than someone who takes care of my daughters. I see someone who understands me, someone who isn't afraid of my pain, someone who makes me want to be a better version of myself. That's not gratitude, it's something much deeper. They stood there in the middle of the kitchen, the world reduced to just the two of them. Finally, Julia nodded slowly. Okay, we'll try, but you have to promise me something. Anything you want. Julia took a deep breath. If at any point this starts to negatively affect the girls, if there's any sign that we're causing them harm, we promise to stop. We promise to put their well-being above our own. Ethan nodded without hesitation. I promise. I will always put my daughters first. Julia gave a small, trembling smile. I know. It's one of the things I love most about you. The word hung in the air between them. Love. Julia realized what she had said and her eyes widened. I didn't mean, she began, but Ethan cut her off with a kiss that said he was falling too, that maybe he had already fallen, that love was terrifying and wonderful and inevitable. When they separated, they were both smiling, despite the tears, despite the fears, despite everything. In the following days, Ethan noticed subtle changes. Julia was still present, still cared for the girls with total dedication, but there was a hesitation in her that hadn't been there before, as if she were constantly policing herself, making sure not to cross invisible lines, not to give people more ammunition for judgment. Ethan hated seeing it. He hated that the outside world was invading the fragile bubble of happiness they had built. One evening, Grace asked a question that caught them completely off guard. They were all in the living room after dinner when she looked at Ethan and Julia sitting on the sofa and asked, "Daddy, is Julia going to be our new mommy?" The silence that followed was absolute. Emily and Olivia looked on curiously, waiting for the answer. Ethan and Julia exchanged nervous glances. Julia was pale, clearly terrified by the question. Ethan took a deep breath, choosing his words, with extreme care. Ethan knelt on the floor to be at the girls' level. "Grace, Emily, Olivia, come here." The three approached, their identical little faces curious and attentive. Julia remained on the sofa, tense as a violin string about to snap. Ethan held the hands of his three daughters. "Do you remember Mommy?" he asked gently. All three nodded solemnly. "Every day," Grace said. "I dream about her sometimes," Emily added. "She smelled like flowers," Olivia completed. Ethan felt a lump in his throat but continued. "Mommy will always be your mommy. Nothing and no one can change that. She's here," he touched each of their chests, "in your hearts. And she always will be." The girls nodded, understanding. "But can Daddy like other people too?" Grace asked with the simple, direct logic of children. "He can," Ethan confirmed. "The heart has room for lots of people at the same time. Julia is very special to us, isn't she?" "Yes," the three answered in unison. "She makes the best cookies," Emily said. "And she plays horsey with us," Olivia added. "And she lets us paint even when we make a mess," Grace completed. Ethan smiled. "Exactly. Julia cares a lot about you. And Daddy cares a lot about her too. But that doesn't mean we're forgetting Mommy. We'll never forget." Olivia tilted her head. "So can Julia be like a second Mommy? Like having two?" Ethan looked at Julia, who had tears streaming silently down her face. "Maybe one day," he said carefully, "if you want that. If it's something that makes all of us happy. But for now, Julia is Julia. And that's already very special." The girls seemed satisfied with that answer. "Can I hug Julia?" Emily asked. "Of course you can," Ethan said. The three ran to the sofa and threw themselves into Julia's arms, who hugged them tightly, now crying openly. "We love you, Julia," Grace said with the brutal sincerity of childhood. Julia sobbed. "I love you too. So much. More than I can say." The girls snuggled against her, completely oblivious to the emotional weight of the moment. For them, it was simple. Julia loved them. They loved Julia. Daddy and Julia liked each other. Mommy was in heaven, but still in their hearts. It all made sense in the crystal-clear logic of childhood. It was the adults who complicated things with fear and guilt and worry about what others would think. Later, much later, after the girls had finally gone to sleep after 1,000 requests for one more story, one more glass of water, one more goodnight kiss, Ethan and Julia met in the library. They were emotionally exhausted, drained by the intensity of the conversation. Ethan poured wine for both of them, something they rarely did. They needed this tonight. They sat on the leather sofa, so close their bodies touched. "That was intense," Julia said, taking a sip of wine. "It was," Ethan agreed. "But it was necessary. The girls needed to understand, and I think they understood better than we do." Julia gave a humorless laugh. "Children have this ability to cut straight to what matters, without all the baggage we carry." Ethan turned to look at her. "Julia, I need to tell you something. Something I've been holding on to." She looked at him, concerned. "What?" Ethan placed his wineglass on the coffee table and took her hands. "When Eleanor left, something in me broke, too. It wasn't just the pain of loss, it was the realization that I had wasted time. So much time. I worked too much, was always too busy, always focused on building an empire that in the end didn't matter compared to the time I could have spent with her and the girls." Julia squeezed his hands, listening. "Eleanor told me to slow down, begged me to spend more weekends at home, more free nights, more moments just being a family, and I always promised I would soon, when this project was finished, when that merger was completed, when I reached the next goal. But the next goal always led to another and another and another." Tears began to fall from Ethan's eyes. "And then she was gone, and I realized all those promises were lies. I wasted our finite time together chasing things that didn't matter, and when I tried to be present for the girls after she was gone, I didn't know how. I had lost the practice of just being a father, of being present without an agenda, without thinking about meetings and spreadsheets. I failed Eleanor. I failed my daughters, and I was drowning in that guilt until you arrived." Julia had tears in her eyes now. "Ethan, you didn't fail. You did the best you could, with the tools you had." But Ethan shook his head. "No, I could have done better. I should have done better. And I'm so scared, Julia. So scared of repeating the same mistakes with you, of letting work consume everything again, of losing another love because I don't know how to balance life and ambition, of waking up one day and realizing I've wasted my second chance." Julia placed her hands on his face, forcing him to look at her. "Then don't. Be different this time. You already are different. You're here now, you're present with your daughters in ways you weren't before. That counts. Every moment counts." "You saved me," Ethan whispered. "You saved the girls. You saved me. How can I ever repay you for that?" Julia smiled through her tears. "You don't have to repay me. It's not a debt. It's love. And love isn't a transaction. It's a free and complete gift." They kissed then, a kiss salty with tears, but full of promises. When they pulled apart, Ethan said, "I want to marry you." Julia froze completely. "What?" "I want to marry you," Ethan repeated. "I know it's soon. I know people will judge. I know there are 1,000 reasons to wait, but I don't want to waste any more time. I want to build a life with you. I want the girls to grow up seeing an example of love and commitment. I want to wake up every day next to you and know that I chose right this time." Julia stared at him with wide, shocked eyes. "Ethan, that's—" she began, but he interrupted her. "You don't have to answer now. I just needed you to know that this isn't casual for me, that I'm all in on this, on you, on us." Julia closed her eyes, taking a deep breath. When she opened them again, there was determination in them. "Yes." The word came out in a whisper. "Yes?" Ethan repeated, wanting to be sure he'd heard correctly. "Yes," Julia said louder. "I want to marry you. I want to be a stepmother to your daughters. I want to build a family together. I'm scared, terrified actually, but I want it. I want it so much." Ethan pulled her into a tight hug, feeling as if his heart would explode with happiness and relief and love. They stayed like that for a long time, just holding each other, letting the reality of what they had decided sink in. Finally, Julia pulled back a little. "We have to do it the right way, slow enough for the girls to adjust, fast enough not to live in fear." Ethan nodded. "We'll do it together. Every decision, every step. Together." "Together," Julia agreed. But there was something Julia hadn't told him yet. Something she had been holding on to carefully, waiting for the right moment. "Ethan," she began hesitantly, "there's something you need to know about why I really came to work here." Ethan frowned. What do you mean? Julia stood up, walking to the window, hugging herself. When I saw your mother-in-law's ad looking for a nanny, it wasn't a coincidence that I replied. I knew your story. I knew Eleanor's story. Ethan stood up too, confused. How? Julia turned to face him, tears streaming. Because Eleanor saved me once. 5 years ago, when I was at a very low point in my life, depressed over the loss of my sister, unable to move on. I was in a grief support group, and Eleanor was there too. Her mother had recently passed away. We became close. She helped me see that life goes on, that my sister would have wanted me to be happy. Eleanor literally saved me from a very dark place. Ethan was speechless. You knew Eleanor. Why didn't you tell me? Julia sobbed. Because I was afraid you'd think it was manipulation, that I was here out of pity or guilt or for some wrong reason. But when I heard she had passed and that her daughters were suffering, I knew I had to help. It was my way of honoring the woman who saved me, of paying back what she did for me. But then I fell in love with your daughters, with you. And now I don't know if you'll be able to trust me, knowing I kept this from you. Ethan processed this information, his brain working in overdrive. Eleanor knew Julia. Eleanor had helped her. And now Julia was here helping Eleanor's family. It felt like fate. It felt as if Eleanor had sent Julia to them in some impossible-to-explain way. You should have told me, he said finally, but I understand why you didn't. And it doesn't change anything. In fact, it explains a lot. It explains why you understand so much, why you're not afraid, why you know exactly what to say and do. Eleanor taught you. Julia nodded, relieved. She was incredible, Ethan. So full of life and love and wisdom. I owe her everything. And I promise to honor her memory every day. I promise to love your daughters as if they were my own. I promise to make Eleanor proud. Ethan walked to Julia and hugged her tightly. She's already proud. Wherever she is, she's seeing this and she's happy. Because she loved you too and she knew you would be perfect. For us. Maybe she always knew. Maybe this was always the plan. They held each other, crying and laughing at the same time, the weight of secrets finally lifted, the truth finally free. The revelation that Julia had known Eleanor changed everything, and yet changed nothing. Ethan spent the next few days processing that information, but every time he looked at Julia caring for the girls, he saw not manipulation or deceit, but genuine love and purpose. Eleanor had touched Julia's life deeply, and now Julia was paying it forward in the only way she knew how, by loving the family Eleanor had left behind. Ethan decided they needed to tell Margaret everything. She deserved to know the whole truth. He called his mother-in-law on a Sunday afternoon and asked her to come for a special lunch. He said they had something important to discuss. Margaret, ever perceptive, asked if everything was all right. It's more than all right, Ethan assured her, but I need to tell you a few things in person. Margaret arrived the following Sunday carrying grocery bags. She brought ingredients to make the lasagna her granddaughters loved. The same recipe Eleanor used to make. The Triplets ran to hug her as always, and soon they were all in the kitchen, making a joyful mess as they prepared lunch together. Ethan and Julia watched from the doorway, smiling at the scene. After lunch, when the girls went to play in the garden, the 3 adults sat in the living room. Margaret looked at them curiously. So, what's so important it had to be said in person? Ethan took Julia's hand, giving her courage. Margaret, we want to tell you a few things. The first is that Julia and I are together, officially. Margaret smiled. Dear, that's not exactly news. Anyone with eyes can see how you look at each other. Ethan blinked in surprise. You knew? I suspected, Margaret corrected. And I approve completely before you ask. Ethan let out a relieved breath. But there's more. Julia knew Eleanor. Now it was Margaret's turn to be surprised. She did. How? Julia leaned forward, her hands clasped nervously in her lap. 5 years ago, I was in a grief support group. I had lost my sister and was having a hard time coping. Eleanor was there too, dealing with the loss of her mother, who was Ethan's grandmother. We became friends. She helped me tremendously, showed me it was possible to keep living despite the pain. She literally saved my life." Margaret had tears in her eyes. "My Eleanor was always like that, always helping others." Julia nodded. "When I heard from a mutual friend that Eleanor had passed and that her family was struggling, especially her daughters, I knew I had to do something. I saw the ad you placed looking for a nanny, and I applied. It was my way of repaying what Eleanor did for me. But then," Julia looked at Ethan, "I fell in love with these incredible girls, and with Ethan. And now I don't know where the gratitude for Eleanor ends and my own heart begins." Margaret was quiet for a long moment, processing it all. Then she stood up and walked over to Julia. The young woman stood too, clearly nervous about how Margaret would react. Margaret hugged her tightly. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for loving my daughter enough to take care of her family. Thank you for being the answer to my prayers. Because I did pray, you know. I prayed for someone special to come into their lives and bring the light back, and you were that person." Julia sobbed in Margaret's embrace. "I promised to honor her. I promised to make Eleanor proud." Margaret pulled back, holding Julia's shoulders. "You already are. Every day." The two women cried together, bonded by their love for a person who was no longer there but whose impact continued to ripple outward. Ethan watched, his own face wet with tears. This was healing. This was the circle closing in a beautiful, unexpected way. "There's one more thing," Ethan said. "Margaret and Julia turned to him. I asked Julia to marry me, and she said yes." Margaret let out a cry of joy. The girls, hearing the noise, came running in from the garden. "What happened?" Grace asked, concerned. Margaret knelt to their level. "Girls, you have the best news. Your daddy and Julia are getting married." The triplets looked at each other, processing. Then they all started jumping and screaming at the same time. "We're having a wedding. Can we wear pretty dresses? Is Julia going to live here forever?" The questions came too fast to answer. Ethan and Julia laughed, hugging the excited girls. "Yes, we're having a wedding. Yes, you can wear the prettiest dresses we can find. And yes, Julia already lives here, but now it will be official. She'll be a real part of the family." Emily stopped jumping and looked seriously at Julia. "Will you still let us make a mess when we paint?" Julia laughed through her tears. "Always," Olivia asked. "And will you still play horsey with us?" "For the rest of our lives," Julia promised. Grace, always the most thoughtful, asked, "What about Mommy? Will she be mad?" Everyone fell silent. Ethan knelt to be face to face with Grace. "Mommy won't be mad, my love. You know why? Because Mommy was friends with Julia. She knew Julia and loved her. And Mommy always wanted you to be happy. She always wanted Daddy to be happy too. So if we're all happy together, Mommy is happy too, from wherever she is." Grace thought about it and then nodded, satisfied with the explanation. "Can I tell my friends I'm going to have a cool stepmom?" "You can tell whoever you want," Ethan said. The rest of the day was a celebration. Margaret stayed for dinner and then to put the girls to bed. She told stories about Eleanor as a child, about how stubborn and loving and full of life she was. The girls drank in every word, building the image of their mother through their grandmother's memories. Julia listened too, learning more about the woman who had saved her. When the girls finally slept, exhausted from all the excitement, the three adults gathered on the porch. "You have my blessing," Margaret said, "completely and without reservation. Eleanor chose well when she befriended Julia, and fate chose well when it brought Julia back to this family." Ethan hugged his mother-in-law. "Thank you, Margaret, for everything, for understanding, for your support, for being the mother Eleanor was lucky to have." Margaret wiped her tears. "Will you have a beautiful wedding?" "We'll have a simple wedding," Julia said. "Just close family and true friends. We don't want a spectacle. We want meaning." Margaret smiled in approval. Eleanor would have loved that. In the following weeks, the news of the engagement spread. As expected, there was judgment. Some neighbors spoke in hushed tones. Some of Ethan's acquaintances congratulated him with forced smiles that didn't reach their eyes. Brenda, Eleanor's friend, sent a message saying she was disappointed, that she thought it was too fast, too inappropriate. Ethan read the message and simply deleted it. He didn't have the energy to defend his choices to people who didn't matter, but there was also support. Colleagues who congratulated him sincerely, neighbors who said it was time for him to be happy again. The child psychologist who had treated the girls sent a beautiful letter saying that love was the best medicine for grief, that children needed to see their parents happy to learn that life went on after loss. Every positive word counterbalanced 10 negative ones. The triplets were ecstatic about the wedding. They spent hours drawing dresses they wanted to wear, planning decorations, choosing flowers. Julia participated in everything with infinite patience, turning the wedding planning into a family bonding activity. Ethan watched, amazed at how Julia made everything special, everything meaningful, everything about love instead of perfectionism. One night, Ethan was in his study reviewing contracts when Grace appeared at the door in her unicorn pajamas. "Daddy?" "Yes, my love, you should be asleep." She walked over to him and climbed into his lap, something she hadn't done in months. Ethan hugged her, feeling the small, precious weight against his chest. "I'm happy," she whispered. "I'm happy Julia is going to be a real part of our family. I'm happy you're happy, and I think Mommy is happy too." Ethan felt his eyes burn. "I think so too, my love. I think Mommy gave us a gift when she put Julia in our path." Grace yawned. "Love is funny, isn't it? You can love lots of people at the same time and it doesn't make any love smaller. It just gets bigger." Ethan kissed the top of her head. "When did you get so wise?" She giggled. "Julia taught me. She teaches a lot of good things." "She really does," Ethan agreed. He carried Grace back to bed, tucked her in, and gave goodnight kisses to Emily and Olivia as well. When he left the room, he found Julia in the hallway. "Was everything okay?" she asked. "Everything is perfect," Ethan said, pulling her in for a soft kiss. "Absolutely perfect." The wedding took place on a spring Saturday, 6 months after Ethan had proposed to Julia. It wasn't at the mansion or some extravagant venue as many expected. It was in the garden of the house where Eleanor had grown up in Maple Creek, New York, the same house where her parents still lived. It was a place full of happy memories, a place Eleanor had loved deeply. Having the wedding there was a way to honor her, to include her in the celebration in some tangible way. The ceremony was small and intimate. Only 40 people, close family and true friends who genuinely supported their union. Margaret helped organize everything with an enthusiasm that poorly concealed her longing for the daughter who wasn't there to see it. Eleanor's parents, John and Rose, welcomed Julia with open arms. They said any friend of Eleanor's was family, and anyone who loved their granddaughters deserved all the love in the world. Julia cried when they hugged her, feeling the complete acceptance of this family that had suffered so much. The triplets were the flower girls, wearing identical dresses in shades of light pink that they had helped choose. They were radiant, their little faces shining with joy. Grace held the ring pillow with the seriousness of someone on a very important mission. Emily scattered flower petals down the makeshift aisle in the garden. Olivia simply jumped with happiness, unable to contain her excitement. Julia walked down the petal-strewn aisle in a simple but elegant white dress with lace details. She had no father to give her away, but she wasn't alone. Her mother, Connie, walked by her side, proud and emotional. On her other side was Margaret, representing Eleanor in a way, blessing this union. The two older women gave Julia to Ethan, and in the look they exchanged, there was acceptance, love, and hope for the future. Ethan stood at the end of the aisle in a light grey suit, no tie. A casual style, Eleanor had always said, looked best on him. When he saw Julia walking toward him, he felt his heart overflow. She was beautiful, but more than that, she was the promise of renewed life, of second chances, of love that heals. Beside him were his parents, Charles and Diane, who had traveled from Washington, D.C. for the ceremony. They too had fallen in love with Julia, seeing in her the woman who had brought their son back to life. The ceremony was conducted by a celebrant who knew their story well. He didn't avoid mentioning Eleanor. On the contrary, he respectfully included her in the narrative. He spoke of how love has no limits of time or space, how it can transform and grow in unexpected ways. He spoke of how Eleanor and Julia had met in a moment of shared pain, and how that friendship had planted seeds that blossomed years later in a way no one could have predicted. When it was time for the vows, Ethan held Julia's hands and spoke with a firm voice despite his tears. "Julia, you came into my life when I was lost in the deepest darkness, not just me, but my daughters too. We were shipwrecked, drowning in grief, unable to see any light on the horizon. You didn't just bring light, you taught us how to create our own light. You taught me that the heart has an infinite capacity to love, that honoring the past doesn't mean living trapped in it. You gave my daughters back their joy and gave me back my hope. I promise to spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of that gift. I promise to be present, not just physically, but emotionally. I promise not to let work or anything else steal the precious moments we have together. I promise to love you with everything I am, and to love the girls with you, building a family where everyone feels safe, loved, and free to be who they are." Julia was crying openly now, but her eyes shone with happiness. When it was her turn, she took a deep breath and spoke in a trembling but determined voice. "Ethan, when I met Eleanor years ago, she saved me from a very dark place. She taught me that life goes on despite the pain, that it's possible to laugh again, to love again, to be happy again. I never imagined that one day I would have the chance to repay that gift by caring for her family, but what started as gratitude transformed into love, love for the 3 most incredible girls I have ever known. And love for you, a man who faces his pain with courage, who is learning to be vulnerable, who chooses love even when fear screams louder. I promise to honor Eleanor every day, keeping her memory alive and beautiful. I promise to love your daughters as my own, to give them security and joy and everything they deserve, and I promise to love you with patience, with strength, with everything I have. I promise we will be a family, not in spite of the past, but by including it in our story." When the celebrant declared them husband and wife, the kiss they shared was witnessed by the happy tears of everyone present. The triplets ran to hug them, creating a tangle of arms and legs and laughter. Margaret watched from a distance, crying and smiling at the same time, feeling that her daughter was there somehow, blessing that moment. In Margaret's hand was a photo of Eleanor that she held carefully, as if she wanted her daughter to see everything. The reception after the ceremony was simple but joyous. Live music played by a local band. Homemade food prepared by the women of the family. Children ran through the garden, while the adults talked and laughed. Ethan and Julia danced their first dance as husband and wife to a song Eleanor had loved, and no one thought it was strange. It was perfect to include her that way. Afterwards, Ethan danced with each of the triplets, twirling them around the makeshift dance floor in the garden as they shrieked with joy. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Ethan gathered the whole family for a photo. Julia, he, and the triplets in the center. Margaret on one side, Eleanor's parents on the other, his own parents in the back. Everyone smiling all together, all part of a bigger story that transcended pain and found beauty on the other side. Before they took the picture, Grace asked to include something. She ran to Margaret and took the photo of Eleanor her grandmother was holding. She placed the photo in the center where everyone could see it. "This way Mommy is in the picture too," she explained with the simple wisdom of children. Everyone agreed, and the photo was taken with Eleanor present in a way that made perfect sense. That night, back home after a long and emotionally exhausting day, Ethan and Julia put the girls to bed. The 3 were so tired they fell asleep almost immediately. Ethan and Julia stood in the bedroom doorway, watching them sleep. "They're incredible," Julia whispered. "Thanks to you," Ethan said. "Thanks to us," she corrected. "We're a team now, a family." Ethan pulled her into a hug. "I never thought it would be possible to be happy again. I never thought my heart could open up after so much pain. But you proved me wrong. You proved there's always hope, always light, always a chance for a new beginning." They walked together down the hall to the master bedroom, the room Ethan hadn't been able to enter for months after Eleanor's passing. But in recent weeks, he and Julia had rearranged it together, not erasing Eleanor, but creating space for both. There were photos of Eleanor with the girls on the walls, her abstract. Paintings still decorated a corner. But there were also new things, Julia's touches, signs that this was now a space shared between past and future. Ethan could finally sleep there again, not with pain, but with peace. Julia had helped him transform that space from a mausoleum back into a home. They lay down together for the first time as husband and wife, tired but deeply happy. Ethan looked at the ceiling, thinking about everything that had happened. 10 months ago, he was a broken man, lost, unable to see any future beyond the pain. Now, lying next to the woman he loved, with his daughters sleeping peacefully in the next room, surrounded by love and hope, he could finally breathe again. He could finally see that life, despite all the blows it dealt, was also full of moments of unexpected grace. Julia was one of those moments, a gift he never knew he needed until she appeared and changed everything. "Thank you," he whispered in the darkness. Julia turned to him. "For what?" "For existing, for not being afraid, for loving my daughters, for teaching me how to live again, for being exactly who you are." Julia smiled and kissed him softly. "Thank you for letting me in, for trusting me with your heart and your daughters, for being brave enough to love again." They fell asleep, intertwined, two hearts that had known deep pain, finding solace in each other, building a new story together on a foundation of loss transformed into strength. And somewhere in the mystery of the beyond that no one can fully explain, Eleanor was smiling. Smiling because her plan, the one she didn't even know she was making when she saved Julia years ago, had worked out perfectly. She couldn't be there to watch. Her daughters grow old with Ethan, to live all the moments she had dreamed of. But she had left something precious behind, not just memories, but connections that would continue to flourish even in her absence. Julia would take care of them. She would love them, and Ethan had finally learned that the human heart was capable of extraordinary things when it had the courage to remain open, despite the pain. End of story. Dear listeners, we hope the story of Ethan, Julia, and the triplets has touched your hearts as deeply as it touched ours in telling it. This journey of grief transformed into love reminds us that even in the deepest darkness, light can find a way. If this narrative resonated with you, we invite you to subscribe to our channel to follow more stories that explore the complexities of life, love, and overcoming adversity. Leave a like if the story moved you and share your own experiences with second chances and new beginnings in the comments. Every story you share inspires us to continue bringing narratives that celebrate the resilience of the human heart. Don't miss our upcoming content where we will continue to explore the mysteries and wonders of human relationships. Until the next story, and always remember that love has infinite capacity when we allow it to grow.